Sorry if I'm a little late and a little out of it. I'm been fighting off being sick ever since yesterday. Go figure. But I did want to get in on Diablo 3. Now, I want to get a couple of things out of the way right at the beginning. First of all, obviously, the mere fact that I'm reviewing this game means that, in my opinion, it is at the very least a good game worth purchasing. I have actually recommended it to several people who were a little bit on the fence about it because of all the bad things they were hearing. And I don't think it's a perfect game. I don't think it's, well, I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the fact of the matter is I do think it is still a good game, and if you have objection with that, or if you have a problem with that, now is not the time. Or more accurately, this is not the video for you. The second thing I wanted to mention is I have heard an exceptionally large amount of complaining about Diablo 3, and most of it has been poorly worded, poorly formed, illogical, unnecessarily stress-related, trollish, whatever you want to call it. It is very, very vast majority of it has been garbage, basically. I'll just put it frankly. Now, I have nothing wrong with someone who has a legitimate concern or complaint or criticism and puts that forward in an at least semi-intelligent manner with whatever medium they choose to do so therewith. I have a problem with people who are like hate boys, as I've called them in the past, who are just raging and roaring and, no thank you. So that's another thing I wanted to get out right at the top. I am admittedly a little more inclined to be generous to Diablo 3 than normal. Not because it's Diablo, not because it's Blizzard, but because so many people have complained about it so harshly and about such stupid things. Which boggles my mind, because there are legitimate complaints you can make about this game, so I'm not sure why. What do I know? Those two things out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about those complaints first before I get into my list here. First and foremost, I mentioned this back in my beta review that the always online thing, I mentioned the reasons for it in the comments thereof, and I'm not going to rehash that. I am just going to say that having experienced it live, I can now firmly say that I was right in that it is overall a net negative thing. It is something I do disagree with. It is something I do not think added to the game. I don't think it helped anything. Excuse me. And even if one were to say that it enabled the real money auction house to exist, I still don't think that is a net positive gain in order to the game. Now, I will go out on a limb and say that I personally don't think there's anything exceptionally wrong with the real money auction house, and here's why. I'm trying to think how to put this. Basically, it will take some time to level out, but eventually we will reach a point where the real money auction house is the one that is cheaper, technically, but more importantly, it not being used by the type of people who don't want to use it, if that makes any sense at all. In other words, both buyers and sellers who don't want anything to do with the real money auction house, myself included, will be using the gold auction house to the point of exclusion, obviously, and therefore, while the logic could be said and has been said, well, why sell something on the gold auction house when you can sell something in the real money auction house? Eventually, the disparity in the two groups will diverge them sufficiently that you will have the two auction houses. They will be completely separate in terms of consumer base, and there will be very little bleed over between the two, and as such the economy will stabilize itself in between the two auction houses in that manner. Now that'll take time to get there, but this is a sort of thing that we've seen happen before, and is a sort of thing I expect will happen with this. I could be wrong, of course, but um, all that being said, as much as I try to stand up for the real money auction house and say it is not a particularly negative thing, it is by definition automatically negative because it has brought upon us several of the requirements with the always online protocol, excuse me, and has also basically not added anything to the game. And that's my biggest complaint about the real money auction house. Ignore the always online thing, because that's a net negative, and I've got nothing good to say about that. The real money auction house, in my opinion, does not actually add anything to the game. I've gone on record in saying that, purchasing game stuff with real money doesn't bother me, especially if it's cosmetic, for example. I've always thought World of Warcraft goes a good route with that. But actually being able to purchase gear, being required to purchase gear, that sort of thing, which Diablo 3 has not stepped over that line yet, thankfully. That sort of thing, I've never really gotten into, I've never really understood, and I don't really think is beneficial. I don't think it's a net positive. I don't think it overall adds to a game. So, there is that. On top of that is the fact that I don't even know why, but for some reason Diablo's release was pushed forward a little bit, which is very, very strange because this is Blizzard. People who generally wait as long as they need to come out with a game. It is possible they thought maybe Diablo being, I believe, 12 years after Lord of Destruction simply was too long. Maybe it's because they had pressure from up above. I know Vivendi has been looking to sell them lately, so maybe that factored in the equation, because if we are finding out about it this year, that means they knew about it last year, and so forth and so on. I don't know the reason, but I do think that was something that shouldn't have been done. I think the game should have stayed in beta at least another month, maybe two. And I do have to, however, immediately turn this into a positive by being fair and saying that I do give them props for the level of support and assistance they've been giving. One of the things that really caught my attention, and I was actually kind of upset about this until I mentioned it. I think I mentioned this in my previous show. I don't actually recall, because I was discussing this a lot at the time. um, Someone at E3, Blizzard. I think I did mention this. I mentioned this in my E3 review, but I want to mention it again because it's worth noting. Blizzard made a formal apology for the shaky release of Diablo 3. Now, in my completely honest opinion, Diablo 3's release was actually quite well done. It was actually really well done for the difficulties they faced, for the sheer scale of the problems that they were trying to overmount, the 24-hour shifts the people were pulling in order to get that stuff fixed and turned over and worked, and managing to get it functional and working within a matter of days, in my opinion, in my honest opinion, being a realist, was nothing short of phenomenal. And I'm amazed they did as well as they did. That being said, the fact that they still, despite that fact, were willing to come out and publicly say, we're sorry, really speaks volumes, in my opinion. For whoever made that call, that was a good choice, in my opinion, because even if someone like me looks at that and says, you don't have anything to be sorry about, you did great, the fact that they're willing to apologize for it because they couldn't do even better does say something good, in my opinion, and that's just my thoughts on that. And I do think, along those veins, that Blizzard has been doing a fantastic job with patching the game and fixing it and improving it. Yes, the haste nerf was a little bit severe. Speaking completely frankly, I don't think it was. I don't think it is as bad as several people have been made it out to be. Yes, it was a huge, huge nerf in DPS because people were just stacking because it was the only thing that was required. Um, But as soon as you start diversing your gear again, which most people should have done because they announced it well in advance before they were going to put that out, then congratulations, you have better DPS again. And they are not going to nerf the other types of gear. They've gone on record in saying this. Crit, for example, is an excellent example of something they're not going to bring back down because they don't need to, because it's not such an overwhelming one stat matters more than any other thing. And by the way, I agree with this. I agree that haste should have been nerfed. Maybe not quite as much. I'd have to look at numbers, and I don't have those. But when one stat is so desirable that it trumps all other stats to the point where you can stack that stat and nothing else, a problem exists and needs to be reconciled. Maybe they'll balance it back out in the future. Who knows? That's what Blizzard does. That's what they've always done. I know I'm coming out as a bit of an apologist, and again, this is what I mentioned right at the beginning. So many people have complained so badly, and it's pissed me off so much that I tend to be more kind than I otherwise would, because they did kind of bring the hammer down on that nerf, and they have been kind of a little heavy-handed about a lot of things they have, and there are several bugs that are still outstanding, that are reported, that are acknowledged, that need to be fixed. So trying to be fair here, trying to be unbiased as best as I am capable. The game does have its good sides and it does have its bad sides, and they're doing some things right and they're doing some things wrong. Let's discuss a couple other things that they are doing wrong, in my opinion. Limiting the player base to 4 people per group was a decision that I've been trying to come up with a reasoning behind. The only one I've come up with thus far is they were trying to lower the server load, basically, the amount of data that has to be transmitted at any one given time, because all the games are obviously being hosted on their servers, as it would be back in Battle.net and D2, but the data that was being pushed out in D2 was minuscule. And in fact, as we've discussed, there was more open I'm not going to go into the technicals here, the details rather, but there was a lot more information that was being relied on the client side in D2 than there is in D3 because security between the two wasn't really a huge concern. I mean, obviously they were trying to improve it over D1 and did succeed in my opinion, but the real money auction house didn't exist, to put it bluntly, and so much of D3 sits on the servers now, so it's a means of control, it's a means of security, and adding to that security and matching security requirements for that matter. So, what I'm getting at is the point that so much more of the game and the data that is outputted is sitting upon the servers, and therefore maybe limiting the amount of players to 4 in a group so that only 4 people are getting the data dump from any given server at any given time. Servers, really, but server farm, whatever. I'm trying not to get into technical details because I know not everyone actually works in networking and wants to hear me blather on for 30 minutes about exactly how this works. The point I'm trying to get across is that that's the only reason I've been able to come up with as to why they might have reduced the player base size to 4 people. Now, granted, I haven't had a lot of problems with that since release because there's only two, three, four people I play with total, making a group of 5, right? Now you may say, oh, that's a problem. Well, no, it isn't because not everyone has the same sleep schedule. That's 4 people total. The problem was at release when I had something like 12 people, and like 6 of them in vent with me at release at retail when we're sitting there trying to play, and there was something immeasurably frustrating about sitting there trying to figure out who gets to group with whom because the party size is limited to 4. It was such a unique and strange problem to encounter. Something similar happened with Saints Row 3 for anyone who's ever been into that. 2-player limit. That's just frustrating. That's irritating. And I hate it when they do that, especially when they do it so artificially. So I think that's a terrible choice, and it is my honest opinion that will probably go up over time, most likely with the expansion. How far up, who knows? If I were to guess, I'd probably say 6. But I still think that is something that should be done, especially because, even in my case, there is a verifiable possibility on certain days that all 5 of us want to play. This has happened. Everyone gets on, and we're all like, yeah, damn it. And one of us just has to sit because you get my point. I don't think that was a good move, especially for a game that has always been, all the way back to Diablo 1, a game that has always been such a social game, such a game that has encouraged and engendered social cooperation. As I mentioned back in my D1 review, Diablo 1 was basically my first co-op game and really started opening up the floodgates for cooperative gaming, in my opinion, at least in the PC market. Obviously, console games have been doing that for some time. But you get my point here? And it is so strange because if you really look at the game, so much of the game, this is kind of a positive thing I'm talking about, but this is also a negative because of the 4-player limit. So much of the game has been tailored and geared towards cooperative, towards making it smoother. I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about one of my points here in relation to this. Anti-frustration is what most people refer to this as. I just call it convenience features. Anything within the UI, anything within the mechanics of the game, designed to make the game not simpler, not easier, but more convenient. There is a difference between the two, and it is possible to cross over that line. I don't think Diablo 3 has crossed that line. I do think it is much more convenient. Walking over gold, being able to just have the loot texts on, the fact that you only ever see your loot drops and they only ever see their loot drops, the fact that you share experience more or less universally across a wide variance, and the X band has been designed rather well, I might add, such that if you are here in level and they're here in level, by the time you finish that act, he might still be ahead, and indeed will be ahead, but the gap will have closed significantly, despite the fact that you're technically getting nerfed X for being there. You get my point. There's so many different features, and the way quests share, the way progress shares, the way the cutscenes work, so many things have been designed around the idea of this convenience and getting fingerprints on my glasses, and and cooperative play and the social aspect of it that I just don't understand why they would make a game design like this and then limit it. Now, of course, again, to be fair, yes, I do understand why they do that, because the game was designed several years ago, and all these concepts, all these convenience features, all these social actions are things that were designed and implemented even, designed and inspired by, what's the word I'm looking for here? whatever, thought up and then designed and then implemented some time ago, long before they decided, for whatever technical reason, they had to limit the player size. So I'm sorry, I've been talking about that a lot, but that is arguably that is my second biggest complaint about the game. I'm not going to talk about my biggest complaint much more because there's not much else to say. Online play bad. you know, dirty glasses bad. I mean, it's just really simple. When you get down to it, what are you going to say?
There is nothing good in only online play.
What do you want from me at this point? I could give you a specific example. I get home Monday night, or rather my Monday night, which is actually Tuesday morning. I get home, I'm tired, I want to unwind a little bit. It's one of my only periods I actually have to myself because I just got off work. That's actually when my weekend starts, and I don't work Tuesday and I don't work Wednesday. And so, I get off work and I just want to unwind a little bit. And I go and, hey, I want to play Diablo 3, but I can't because it's under maintenance, or because they're testing this, they're patching something, or because they're doing BattleNet maintenance, which also brings down WoW and StarCraft 2, my other go-tos for I just feel like playing something for a little bit. That is beyond frustrating. And that's a little example. That's a small example. As I've said before, latency in a single-player game, or a game you're playing with friends, is unacceptable, to be perfectly frank. And it's really sad when I'm sitting there in Vent and I'm with one of my friends and we're in one game, and the other two people in Vent are in a completely other game because they're on alts or whatever. And we both, or we all four of us, are talking, and all of a sudden all four of us are like, oh, lag, lag, and it's so obvious every time it happens. No. Bad, Blizzard. Bad. Give us land playback. Especially with StarCraft 2. Seriously with StarCraft 2. Moving on. But I want to talk about some positive things about the game, if I may. Those are all my only real complaints about the game, to be completely honest with you. The complainers about the game, which I'm going to go ahead and list as one of my complaints about the game, because oh my god, it drives me crazy. The always online thing, the real money auction house, and the 4-player limit. Past that, I don't actually have many complaints about the game, to be completely honest about you, and I'm going to start talking about these in depth here. Let's talk about gameplay mechanics here. We've got I talked about this briefly in the beta comment. There's so much gameplay and story integration, or at least gameplay and setting integration within the game. As I mentioned before, for example, the wizard is a fantastic example of this, because the wizard is by nature a very unstable element. Someone who is tapping into magic humans should not be using, people should not be using, regardless of species, is doing things beyond the bleeding edge, you know what I mean? She's literally hanging over the precipice, metaphorically speaking. And so naturally, her mechanic is she has a relatively small mana pool that, I keep saying she because my wizard's female, a relatively small mana pool that restores very quickly. You get where I'm going with there? It's a very quick, action-paced, make a decision now, okay, now give it a moment, now, very burst, on-edge type of feel. The barbarian with the rage and the constant build-up, the steam train concept is what the barbarian is. You get going slowly, but once you do, it's going to be much, much harder to stop you, and indeed much harder to slow down, and so forth and so on. You get my point. I could go over all of them individually, but the point is there's a great deal of integration with the flavor and the lore and the backstories, basically, of what the classes are and how they are actually played, which I think is a fantastic thing. Along that note, excuse me. Let's just go down the list here. I didn't make these in any particular order, and I do apologize. Like I said, I've been sick, and I've actually been pretty busy at work tonight. This is my first break all night. Goodness, and it's already late. I like the random quote system. I mentioned this in my Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect 2 reviews as well, and I think Diablo 3 does implement it very well. You're just randomly passing by an NPC, and they will say something that has to do with where you are in the quest, and it's usually something directly related. It's not something you have to listen to, but if you do hear it, it does add to it. It adds to the story, it adds to the setting, it adds to the NPCs, it makes them fleshed out a bit. It's one of those things I keep referring to in many of my reviews of making you feel like you're in more of a world, making it more animated, making it more viable, making it more alive, rather than just a game you're playing. My favorite, of course, and this probably won't surprise anyone, is the Keep Defender and his wife who are talking in Act 3. Their conversations amuse me greatly. But there are several, there are several in all of them. In every single one of the acts, there's those conversations on it. You usually made a point every quest to just kind of make a runaround just to hear what everyone said. And it wasn't out of the way or irritating like Mass Effect 3 was, and it wasn't absolutely required, so I don't have to do it again, but I can do it at any time during the quest, and it is so convenient. Speaking of convenience features, I'm sorry, I meant to mention this earlier. The new town portal is an amazing invention. I think that was basically brilliance in itself. Along with that, the fact that you don't have to ID most items, and the items you do have to ID take a few seconds and you just involve a right click. Yes, absolutely. God, so many things were done right in this game. They really were. But I loved that, and I love the fact that if you're alone, you will say random things basically to yourself. If you're with a henchman, you'll say different things based on the circumstances, based on who you're with, and there's actually a ridiculously large amount of dialogue in the game. In order to get it all, you basically have to go all the way through with one hench, and then with another, and then with the third, in order to hear it all, because they all say so many different things at so many different points in the game, including the parts of which you shouldn't technically have any of them because they knew you'd be New Gaming Plusing. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and talk about that. I've always been a big proponent of New Game Plus. I've said this before. And I usually use games like Chrono Trigger as the highlight of how to do New Game Plus. Diablo 3 has the closest thing I've ever seen to perfect New Game Plus in a game. It is not only the classic New Game Plus, you reset the world, but you stay the same, right? That's basically New Game Plus in a nutshell. Reset the world, you stay the same, okay? Not only is that true, but you can actually pick at which point you can hop to. You do not lose progress. This is important because most New Game Pluses, when you do this, you lose wherever you were and you reset your new point here. In Diablo 3, you can hop back and forward to wherever your furthest progress is, and you can have other people join you at any point, and you are automatically, because the world is at that point, it doesn't matter where you are, if you follow what I'm saying, because as long as you have it unlocked to some extent or another, as far as acts, for that matter, you can still hop there. If you have walked into Act 4, you can then leave and join a game where someone is killing Diablo, and there you are. So, beautiful, amazing system, incredibly designed. The quick play thing is one of the greatest features I've ever seen. I want to join my friend. Bam, I'm there. 3 seconds. One of the only things I think that they did implement very well about the BattleNet system. Well, I guess I should say this a little bit differently. I still think it shouldn't be always online only. However, I do have to freely admit that I would still be playing in BattleNet primarily, especially given how convenient and useful the features of BattleNet are. I love the fact that I can just, there, go play with my friend, go do this, random game. Just like that. I love it. I love the convenience. I love the speed. I love the features that are available to you, the choices that are available to you in doing so. Very enjoyable. Now, next thing I want to talk about. I'm sorry if I'm kind of rushing through this, but I'm in a bit of a time deadline. I do apologize. Inferno Mode. Now, this is probably going to be one of those things that most people disagree with me on, and that's acceptable as long as, I've said it before. If you disagree with me for legitimate reasons and you think, oh, I disagree with you, and here's why. I get several comments like that. I have no problem with that. In fact, I encourage it because we are individuals and we should have the ability to choose regardless of whatever the popular medium is. And in this case, I do like Inferno Mode. I liked Inferno Mode before they nerfed it. I do think the nerf was a good idea because I think making it so that the damage was slightly less was something that makes it slightly more accessible. The only reason I think that's a good thing is because so many people wanted to get into Inferno Mode, and in my opinion, the outlook there was that they didn't think so many people would. But lots more people did, and so bringing it down in difficulty was something I think that made a good deal of sense. I have a great deal of sympathy for the for the designers, for the people who actually do what I would want to do at a gaming company. Set up the settings, set up the lore, set up the fights, set up the dialogue, that kind of thing. I have a great deal of sympathy for that. I did mention fights in there very specifically because I enjoy making boss fights as I do for my games and D&D and GURPS and all that fun stuff. And making something that is challenging but not frustrating, but not too easy, and still rewarding is an incredibly difficult mix of just doom here in order to balance out. And doing that for a scale of player competency, I guess, which overall I don't mean competent as in you're incompetent. What I mean is to use an aggregate phrase that refers to skill, time, investment, gear, everything that is part of how good you can be at any given point in time. So that's what I mean when I say to that. I don't mean to call anyone incompetent. That scale of competence and incompetence and whatever within Diablo 3 is so vast that making a boss that fits this is insane. And it's no surprise to me that, for the most part, the actual act bosses are more like down here, whereas a lot of those quad champions, as I call them, are like up here, or indeed up here in some cases. And it's also worth noting that whenever Blizzard designers have tried to make something that's hard, and I gotta use this, what has inevitably happened is that unless they use some artificial gating method, it's defeated within a week or two. WoW was extremely bad about that, or rather, people were extremely, you know what I mean. That situation was extremely bad in WoW. All right, heroic, four people, alone in the darkness. Yogg Saron. How long did it take people to? I don't remember the actual time, but it did not take long for somebody to go through and beat that. Now, for anybody who's done that fight, you know just how ridiculously, insanely difficult that actually is to do, and people were doing that within a fairly, relatively short period of time. And so when they released Inferno Mode much harder than they were capable of playtesting to defeat, that doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, I actually would probably do the same thing at that point, because what else are you going to do? If you don't make it ridiculously hard, people are just going to complain that it's too easy. And the hardcore crowd, which is a crowd of Blizzard, it is a player base, it is a market share, has to be garnered for in some manner or another. So, and the fact that people were making progress in Inferno before the nerf, it just kind of makes my point. Now, I have not beaten Inferno, I freely admit this. Most of this is because I've put Diablo 3 down. Um, I have other things to do. I was working on my project with the Mass Effect 3 ending with Ivan, and then I've been working on my campaign lately because I was wanting to get that done. I am done with that now. I'm going to start actually running my new campaign this Tuesday. And, I've just been busy, but my point is that I was getting somewhere. I was progressing. It was slow. But of course it was slow. It was difficult, but of course it was difficult. To be completely honest, I was never actually frustrated by it. Maybe that's because I went into it expecting worse, or maybe that's because I went into it thinking, this is going to be beyond my level, beyond my competency. And it wasn't. Now, it took a lot of perseverance, but I guess what I'm trying to say overall here is I think they did Inferno Mode correctly. I think that throwing ridiculously, insanely powerful champions at you was a good idea. I think that making it so that those are the barriers of obstacles, not just in progression, but in terms of gear, was a good idea. I do think that having the goblins, the various types of goblins in Inferno Mode, especially in Act 2, dropping the best loot is also a good idea, because I've always said that at some point or another, you can't just spread the loot out evenly. This doesn't work as well as it sounds. When you this is an idea that's good on paper and not good in execution. You need to have something that people can focus on. And the goblins are a great thing because they're relatively random. What they drop is still relatively random, and they still have a very good chance of killing you indirectly, which is awesome, and I think is a great idea. And of course, you can just miss them if you don't kill them quickly enough. So, moving along. I'm going to segue from that right into something else I do think was a great idea, and that is Valor of the Nephilim, which I think was one of the better ideas they've ever come up with. Now, it has been debated whether or not, and I had one of my friends actually rant at me at length about this, how much he hates the fact that every time he tries to respec or try something else, he loses his stacks. But I personally don't disagree with that. I think that's a decent measure of control on the situation, and the fact that it persists through death is basically exactly right. That is what should be, especially because it's going to be on Inferno. It should persist through death. It should last a decent amount of time, 30 minutes. It should be something that is challenging to keep up, and it should be something that is rewarding to keep up. And it is all of these things. I think it was very beautifully designed. I would not change anything about the Valor Nephilim. Great idea. And I guess I'll go ahead and segue into my next point here, which is the multi-suffix bosses, or quads. We've been calling them solos, duos, trios, and quads in my little circle of friends. Quads are wonderfully diverse in the gamut. Obviously, anybody who knows that there are pairings, or I shouldn't even call it pairings. There's like brackets of suffixes that boxes could have. I don't know what they actually call them, but I've been calling them suffixes because it's Diablo. Of types of suffixes that you'll see within categories with other suffixes, and so there are certain types of bosses, generally speaking, that you're going to encounter. That being said, even in Inferno, and especially in Inferno, I should say, you'll still encounter suffix quads that are over here in terms of difficulty, relatively easy. You get them down. It takes some effort. It takes some work, and they're gone. Then there's ones over here which are viciously difficult, but you will actually manage it. Maybe you have to kite a little bit. Maybe you have to use some creative tactics. Whatever works. And then there's the ones over here, which are so insanely ridiculously difficult that you try to avoid them. Or you actually do manage to pull out a kill on them. It just takes forever. Notice that I didn't mention frustration in any of this range here. I personally, this is just me, didn't actually get frustrated on any level of this range, and so I think that the quad system worked very well, and it was always something that wasn't just artificial difficulty. I shouldn't say always. 60% of the time it wasn't artificial difficulty. It was suffixes that made sense to go with each other and actually added a degree, a layer of the tactics that you needed to start employing. There are some bosses that are just plain, middle finger to the players, and those are usually over here on this side. The invulnerable minions in any combination with anything tend to sit in that category, but you get the point I'm trying to get across. I do think that was a good idea, and I do think that in combination with the other things they did, like the Nephilim Valor and the way they did loot distribution, I think that was a good move. Now, what else we got here? PvP. I wanted to talk about this briefly. I think PvP is going to be very enjoyable in Diablo 3, especially since they're going to add actual arenas and, go here to PvP sections and stuff like that. And it's going to be optional. Like I like that about Diablo 2 as well. I don't know if the epic duels are going to come back. As I mentioned in my last video, and several of my commenters did too, the duels you'd get into in Diablo 2 could really become epic. You would see fire and lightning and ice and hups and axes and just everything flinging across the screen at Mach 20, and keeping up with all of it was just insane. Wonderful, beautiful things. I don't know if we're going to see that again, because the simple problem is it going to be like the arena in WoW, where matches last about a minute tops, where we just one side just destroys the other or is destroyed first? Or are we going to see players who are so accustomed to living against the quads that it's actually going to be a proper duel, if you know what I mean? And I'm kind of hopeful for the latter, to be honest with you. I would enjoy that a lot. Enjoy really sinking my teeth into it. I'm looking forward to PvP in Diablo 3, and I'm going to be keeping my eye on that. Obviously, I can't say anything else because it's not out yet, but moving along. One other thing I wanted to talk about as far as gameplay mechanics really quick here. Uh, or I should say, not story, because the whole other category is just story. The graphics of the game, I think, personally, are absolutely gorgeous. I think it is a beautiful game. It is extremely aesthetic, it is extremely stylized, but it is done amazingly well. The animations are insanely smooth and flawless and moving. It's that whole alive world thing I was talking about earlier again. Everything everywhere looks like it is alive. Everything everywhere looks like it is something that is part of a world, and it flows beautifully. And on top of that, I really want to mention this specifically. Anyway, let me pull up my own camera so I can see myself here, so I can do this. If you're walking along here, and this is the actual foreground you're doing, actually, it's kind of at the angle thing, isn't it? And you're doing this thing, and you're walking along, and this is all very well detailed. The grass moves, there's swaying in the wind, there's a couple of leaves blowing, maybe there's probably a bird. All sorts of tiny little details that were added to flesh this out. And then on top of that, I'll actually use the background here as an example. There's just all this back there. And if you start looking, and this is actually going to be a really good example, because I'm going to use this as a specific example. If you look with me back in the background here, you can see, those headphones over there, and you can see that they're on one of those little hook things right there. You can see someone's cup over in that direction. You can see there's this monitor. There's some papers up there, and there's this pens over here, and there's this what is that actually? Oh, it's a water bottle. Water bottle over here. My point I'm trying to get across is there are so many details in the background. They are so detailed. They're so complicated. I weep to think of the 12-hour shifts their graphics artists were pulling off in order to get all that crammed in there. And it doesn't affect performance, too, because of the way they did multi-layering on the graphics design, which I mentioned back in the beta review. I'm not going to go into again. And so that's the kind of touches, the kind of flavoring that I love most about a game because, and this is the most important part, it is completely unnecessary. It adds, well, I shouldn't say that it doesn't add anything because it does. It's not required, though. You will never go back there into the background. You will never go interact with anything. There will never be any loot. There will never be anything plot relevant. There will never be anything game mechanics relevant. It is purely there for your enjoyment, to add to the feeling that this is a world you're walking through and to make you just have those moments of, oh my god, looking at just gorgeousness. I remember distinctly when we just finished going through Leoric's mansion or whatever, and in the background, I looked down and I was like, wait a minute, that's the cathedral. That's the cathedral from earlier in Act 1 back there. Oh my god, that's just one example. Act Two's town is a great example in general. The entire city visible in the background. But it's true everywhere, no matter where you go. Just so much detail. I was soaking it up. I still soak it up. Even playing through it now, I still look at the background. I just look and get killed because I'm looking at the background rather than the quad who walks up and beats my face in 3 hits. But I don't mind because it was so enjoyable. You know what I'm talking about here? I hope at least someone knows what I'm talking about because it's just so amazing. One last thing I want to talk about is there's a lot of callbacks in this game, and I think most of them were well done and amusing enough that they made me grin or actually laugh out loud. The one that made me laugh the hardest, I just feel like sharing this one little story, is Garbad the Strong. Because Garbad the Weak was always one of my favorite little side quests back in Diablo 1, and seeing Garbad the Strong and fighting that fight was just like, yes! And it was hilarious too because my friend who was just sitting over here actually when we were going through that was looking at that like, uh, is there a reference here? Because I'm laughing. And he's over there and he's like, is there a reference I'm getting? I was like, I'll explain it later. Because, how do you explain that? How do you explain Garbad the Weak? No here, no hurt, no kill. You know. Yes, I'm just that much of a geek. And proud of it. Now, what else have we got here? Oh yeah, there's actually one thing I wanted to talk about. This is just kind of as an aside. There's a lot of things that I am inclined to believe are subtle touches, things that were done with deliberation within Diablo 3. And I could be wrong. I could be reading too much into it. Lord knows I analyze things to the nth degree. That's just the way my mind works. But one of those things is Belial. Now, when you fight Belial, he says, behold the true Lord of Hell. He doesn't talk like that. And he pops out of the ground and everything wastes away and you're in this hellish nightmare world and he does his awesome attacks and it's a ridiculously tough fight on Inferno. Actually, I'm lying. It wasn't that hard. It's just dodging his stuff was actually interesting because you had to actually do it. And so you're fighting Belial and all that happens and you defeat him and he passes away. Ah! And all of the terrain comes right back up, right? Now, I say this is subtle because most people don't even think twice about it. In fact, I actually mentioned this to several of my friends, and they were like, "Oh, I never realized that." Never actually clicked. That's my favorite kind of subtle. It's the thing that isn't so subtle that you don't notice it. It's so subtle that it is subtle such that you do notice it, you just don't consider it relevant. What I'm trying to get at here is Belial, the Lord of Lies, was effectively pulling a matrix on you. What I mean by that, and this is just possibly just conjecture, but he was trying to kill you in your own mind, and your own mind, because of the sheer severity of the way of the realism, the direct control he had over your perception, because he's the Lord of Lies, was capable enough to convince you that you had died, and thus, though he could not defeat you personally, he could kill you in your mind, and you would die for real. You see what I'm going with this? And then once you defeat him, in his mind, you get it here? And then, of course, everything reforms because you never actually went anywhere and nothing ever actually happened. I thought that was an awesome little touch. I just felt like mentioning that. I'm going to mention this here, too. A friend of mine, actually several friends of mine, and one message giver, you know who you are, asked me what I thought was going to be going on as far as new classes in the expansion, because it is a commonality for there to be at least one class in an expansion in a game like this. And Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 both did have additional classes, or a class in the case of Diablo 1. And yes, I know it wasn't official, but you get my point. There are two classes I think that are at least likely. One is an idea of a friend's and one is an idea of mine. The Alchemist is one of those ideas. The idea here being that you're essentially someone who is effectively a machinist. If you've ever played FF10 or an alchemist from several of the FF series. You have potions as an. You know what? If you've ever played an engineer in Guild Wars 2, that's exactly where we're going with this. You change your skill loadout based on what potions you've drunk and what you're carrying and whatnot. You obviously have less of a variety of skills overall in order to compensate for this, but you have a lot more flexibility in changing them on the fly in a manner that you basically can't do with any other class. I mean, you can, but you shouldn't. And I think that would be interesting. The other idea is what is effectively a fallen angel. Not fallen as in the sense of, a demon or whatever, or like poor Iswal, the meat shield, but like in the sense that Tyrael was, if an angel that has willingly chosen to become human, and as such, it would be effectively what amounts to a paladin class. Lots of buffs, lots of effects, lots of holy damage, lots of flashy lights and that kind of fun thing. It would look really cool, I think. And the only skill I've thought up specifically for that one would be the ultra mode. Most classes have something to that extent. The ultra mode, like the wings for the the demon hunter. The avatar for the barbarian, and of course the archon for the wizard. Blah blah blah. Would be actually regaining his wings temporarily, be going into full angel form, complete with the cowl, no face, and just. And I think that would be really cool personally. But moving along, let's get to the story, shall we? I've heard a lot of people complain about the story in Diablo 3. Would you believe I've never heard anyone say why? I mean that sincerely. I believe that there are people, because I've heard well-reasoned sounding arguments saying that the story is bad in Diablo 3, but I've never actually heard what they thought was bad, and I find that odd because I think that the story is one of the strongest points of Diablo 3, and one of the reasons I enjoy it so much. Let's talk about Diablo 3 as a game by itself, okay? One of the things I've mentioned before, I don't remember which game I was talking about this in reference to. Baldur's Gate 2. I was talking about Baldur's Gate 2, and I mentioned how they had to design the story from the perspective of first playthrough and subsequent playthroughs. It had to make sense when you're playing it the first time that the scope of the threat is escalating as you go. But it had to make sense within an in-story perspective so that when you're playing it the second time, even though this is the real threat up here, this is still a legitimate threat. This is still a big threat. And so it still feels big even though there's bigger later. Diablo 3 pulled that off very effectively, I thought. The scope of the threat in Diablo 3 escalated rather linearly, actually, until the end there. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that it did that it accomplished that very well. You need to start off. What's the threat? Zombies to a town. Okay, you escalate that a little bit, and again, zombies to a town. This is a relatively major threat, and it's something that could spread. So it's actually a fairly major threat. You go up and you get to the point where you start learning about the cultists. Okay. Again, escalating the threat. These cultists have more reach and capacity to destroy and hurt and maim and corrupt than a bunch of roaming skeletons do. We escalate just a little bit more. We find out that someone is making a bid for a kingdom. This is Belial, of course. And we take out the cultists in an awesome moment. Start going after what is effectively, at this point, a demon empire, because Belial has so thoroughly taken over this kingdom, whose name I can't think of off the top of my head, that at that point it has permeated virtually all of its layers. Again, big threat, and again, larger threat. We escalate again. The attack on Ariat and the demon army that are coming to try and take the Black Soul Stone, and the fact that he ultimately very nearly won. If we hadn't showed up, he would have. Still with it. Escalate again. The primeval, Tathamat, or, Tathamet, actually, I believe, or whatever you want to call it, and the destruction of all light and all life, and the establishment of a new kingdom of evil and darkness, right? Yeah, I'd say that's still an escalation. You get where I'm going with here? It does this the whole way through. Now, I think that was extremely well constructed. I think it was extremely well written. All of the twists, all if you could even call them that, all of the evolutions, let's call it that, all of the evolutions of the plot, all of the ways the plot moved, and the scope of the threat, the individuals involved, and the scenery which you go through, all made perfect sense to me, and was very structurally sound, if you know what I mean. Now, let's look at Diablo as a series right now. this is also important. I think this is more important, actually. I don't think they did this on purpose, at least not initially. But I do think that they did this on purpose probably around the time Diablo 2 came out, I think, or possibly Lord of Destruction. They definitely had it in mind by Lord of Destruction. Diablo 1 over here has you as basically a common adventurer, someone who is basically someone who would have been a background NPC in either of the other two games. Still someone who is competent, still someone who is above and beyond what a normal person can do, like an adventurer is, but this is someone who is ultimately very small scale. You save a town, you help a kingdom, you save the people in that town, you end up failing. I'll get more into that a little bit, but moving along. So overall, you yourself are fairly low scale in power, and you are dealing with things that are fairly small in scope. Now you move up to Diablo 2, which was a much larger threat, and you yourself, as we've found out in the lore, thanks to Elysian or whatever the heck his name was, it was in the books. Uh, Turning around the curse of the World Stone so that people started getting more stronger over time rather than weaker. So you are literally a stronger type of individual. You are someone who can do feats and take on demon lords, face to face and all that fun stuff. And you do. You end up going after uh, several demon lords, take down all the primevals, smash their soulstones, blah blah blah. Right? Again, it's actually more like this, and then it jumps up to about here with D2. In D3, you're one of the Nephilim, one of the first Nephilim, actually. And in fact, if it is inferred that you are literally the first Nephilim, the one to break fate's cycle and all that fun stuff. And the scope of the threat, again, it does, even though in Diablo 3 itself would probably be stated to do this in scope of the whole series, by the end of the thing, when you're dealing with the primeval and, the D-Man, if you could call him that at that point, and all that is definitely up here, and you, the player, are in lore a person who is of a scale in order to deal with this. And so at each step, the whole series does the same progression thing that I was just talking about, and it makes sense in lore, and it makes sense on on replays, and it makes sense from a game perspective. And so I think they pulled off that escalation very well. If I might diverge for just a second, a game that did not pull out that escalation quite as well would be the Modern Warfare series. No offense to the Modern Warfare series, but Modern Warfare 1, okay. Modern Warfare 2, okay. Modern Warfare 3, ugh. I'm not going to say any more about that on the moment, but I just wanted to get that point across there. Most games do not pull off that escalation as smoothly and as correctly as the Diablo series did. Now, I mentioned I want to talk about the tonality, and I'm going to go ahead and mention that right now. Diablo 1 and 2 both. When I talk about this escalation thing, this is in terms of the scope of the threat, of the scale of the conflict, of the long-term reaching effects, all that fun stuff, right? It is important to mention that in addendum to this, the tone of the series changes as well. Diablo 1 was very depressing, was very brutal, was very unforgiving, was very creepy, as people have pointed out. It was much scarier than the other two games. And I'm with that. And I agree with that. I personally don't care for that sort of thing, but that's not relevant. What's relevant is the fact that this is where Diablo 1 was. Diablo 2, you do actually have some successes. You do actually save several areas, several kingdoms for that matter. You do actually defeat the primevals. It is ultimately a loss in the end because of the loss of the World Stone, or at least that's what we assumed at the time. And you do ultimately fail to stop Diablo's overall plot that we didn't know existed at the time. But the point is, you still overall the tone was increased. The levity, if I could use such a term, was increased in Diablo 2. In Diablo 3, what we see is the culmination of that. In 1, we saw the crushing despair of pointlessness and hopelessness. The realization that you can do nothing in order to make things better. That was Diablo 1 in a nutshell, as far as the tone of the story. Diablo 2 here was about the endeavor to accomplish more in the face of impossible odds, and could not quite pull it off, but still managed to succeed where others couldn't. Diablo 3 up here is facing insurmountable odds and difficulties and dangers sufficiently powerful in order to overcome things that have maintained a static balance in the status quo for millennia, and barely managed to rise up above it and still pull off the win because screw you, we're the good guys and we're going to win. I'm not phrasing this as well as I'd like because my mind isn't quite here and I'm kind of in a rush. But my point is, I think this was a good move. I think the increase in tonality, as well as scope, as well as scale, was a good thing, was a deliberate thing, and was something that really adds to Diablo 3. It is something that really speaks to the heart of perseverance and the fulfillment of hope, rather than simply a dark and dreary existence. I think that was a good move for the series, personally, and I think that they couldn't, or at least shouldn't, have done that prior to thing. I think Diablo 1 should have been down here. I think Diablo 2 should have been around here, and I think Diablo 3 should have been up here. The trilogy is usually the kind of thing that works best for that sort of thing. If you stretch it out more, you get this kind of thing going on, you know what I mean? The Kingdom Hearts series comes to mind on that. Although I think they pull it off well, but let's not get into that. Now, there are a couple things I want to talk about really quick with regards to the way they approach the lore in Diablo 3. First of all, I do think that adding the little lore books that go throughout the game, having those give X was a good idea, first of all, but having them, because it encouraged players to read them. But on top of that, those being there for the people who didn't read the actual books, the physical books that really went into the lore and the detail in ways that the games never did, was a great move. All of my friends actually did not read the books, and so I was just keeping my mouth shut as we're going through the game. And when we encountered the first book that started talking about something that happened in the books, I don't remember what it was, but they were like, "Oh, well, what's that?" And I was like, "Oh, well, that happened in book blah." And he's like, "Oh, cool." And they summarize it heavily, of course, but they do at least discuss everything that the player missed in between the games, and I think that was an excellent move. I also think the fact that they expand upon it and really go into detail really helps. And of course, they have a lot of what I call the background quest hooks. Things that are not emphasized, things that are not focused on, but things that make you go, "Hmm?" A few minutes later when you start to think about it. One of those examples is the what's his name? I actually wrote down his name. Inarius and his whole deal. Inarius, by most accounts, is still alive, is still trapped somewhere, is still possibly in interaction. It is unlikely, I'll admit, I'll put him as the least likely of the various hooks that could go into future games or indeed into the expansions. But sure, let's go ahead and segue into that, by the way. Expansion or expansions. I think it is actually likely Diablo 3 will have expansions, plural. That is just my opinion. But they do have a significant enough of plot hooks and dangling threads to do so. There's actually 10. And I was just discussing this tonight with several of my friends. Anarius is one of them, as I just mentioned, one of the original progenitors of the Nephilim, and all that fun stuff. Another one is Malthael. I think this is probably going to be a big one. He's mentioned so casually, almost as an aside, but Malthael disappeared after the end of the Diablo 2. And I also want to comment on something else here. I'll go into a second. But Malthael being gone, the Angel of Wisdom being gone, and proposed to be within Pandemonium, searching for answers or whatever he's looking for the truth of reality and all that fun stuff, is something that just screams this is going to be covered later. It just screams quest hook, as I say, or plot hook if you prefer. The thing I wanted to mention about Malthael, again in reference to subtlety, one of the things they show rather directly and explicitly in the game is that when Ariel is gone, or imprisoned rather, hope drains from the world. And it affects everyone. When you go back to the keep, the humans there are hopeless in many extents. Tyrael himself is hopeless. They have lost hope because the Archangel of Hope is missing. Why do I mention this? Because they go so much out of their way to emphasize that, and then they mention really casually and quietly that after Diablo 2, the Archangel of Wisdom vanished. And if you really think about it, that explains a lot. A lot about how the characters interact, a lot about how things were allowed to happen, a lot about the choices that were made between Diablo 2 and into and during Diablo 3. Was because the Archangel of Wisdom was gone, and thus wisdom was gone from the world. And when Tyrael takes up the mantle of wisdom, now of course what that'll say for justice, who knows? Maybe he'll be both, I don't know. I have no evidence on that. I have only conjecture. But I just thought I'd mention that, because I thought that was something they did on purpose. I think that was a subtle point they wanted to get across. And I think, again, based on that and based on the way they present their other things, that Malthael will be one of those big quest hooks. We'll go over to the other small ones first. Covetous Shen and his damn gem, whose name I can't think of, is something that, again, screams quest hook. It's probably going to be a minor point. That's probably something that's going to be kind of a side quest or one of the extra quests as you're going, which is fine, as it should be. Speaking of side and extra quests, I strongly believe that all three of the followers will have their quests resolved. But for anyone who is paying attention, they do grow on you quite a bit throughout the course of the game, and they do expand quite a bit on their own backstory. But they never actually resolve it. The Templar wants to go back to his order to set things straight, but he can't yet because he's helping you. The Scoundrel wants to go back and actually my barbarian had a wonderful conversation where he said, after we are finished here, we will go and save your people. And he's like, what, you can't do that for me? And barbarian's like, yes I can, and I will give you gold for it too. It's a wonderful scene because it's so me too. But the point is that was still something that was left dangling. His brother, his wife, or rather his brother's wife, and the whole deal with the guild, and of course the enchantress and her search for the prophet and the missing sisters. This one's arguable, I'll admit, but let's just not get into that. So all of these are relatively minor points, except for the Malthael one over here, which is probably going to be a big one. Now, on top of that, did I mention Anarias, Malthael, 1, 2, 3, and then Shen. Now, on top of that, we have Adria. Adria is the most obvious quest hook. Most people pick up on this immediately. This is something that they almost have to go into, because she's just left, and that's it. That's the last we hear from her, is at the end of Act 3. She's gone. She is almost assuredly going to have something to do with the expansion. Hopefully not too much, because I just want to kill her in the face. Next thing, this one is officially confirmed and probably going to be, at the very least, the initial focus of the expansion. That is the rescue of Leah. Or is it Leia? No, it's Leah. Um, I have problem pronunciating. Wow, I have problem with pronunciation, if that wasn't obvious, since I keep switching between Diablo and Diablo. But rescuing Leah is something that has been officially confirmed, and at the very least attempting it, we may not succeed, and it will at the very least be the initial focus, if not the complete focus. And I think that's a good direction to go into, because, by God, we need to go rescue her. Damn it. I like Leah. Next point is, what is the next point? Yes. These last two I've saved for last, because other than the Leah thing and the Malthael thing, I think these two are the biggest. This one is the Black Soulstone. Anyone who was paying attention, and I'm sure most people picked up on this immediately, like I did, within seconds. As soon as the Tathamet thing vanishes into the Black Soulstone, and the Black Soulstone crumbles to the earth, I was expecting it to shatter or break or shard or anything, and it just goes below the clouds, and I was like, damn it. It's because it's still there. We don't know what happened with it. We don't know if it'll make any impact. We don't know if any of the souls are still in there, but the Black Soulstone was not destroyed. And that's going to be something huge. Last point, the biggest point by far. Anybody who read the books is probably with me on this. Imperius, the archangel, we think, of horrible person, basically. In fact, they lampshade this really beautifully within the game, because you get to the point where you're going to fight Inarius, finally. And me and Pax were like, yes, we're going to fight Inarius finally, because we were both looking forward to this for some time. And then he's knocked out and you go fight the D-Man. They're almost teasing you. They're dangling the thread. Come on, come on. Imperius has to be something. There's no way they can't do that. That is too big of a thing. They have emphasized that in the books. They emphasize that in the anime. They emphasize that in the game. He is going to be a major thing, and probably the major focus, if I were to say, of the expansion. That's just my opinion on that matter now. I think I'm done, actually. I kind of have to be done because I'm running out of time. So, this is already an hour. My goodness, wow. My last thing I want to say about Diablo 3 is the fact that the game, there are so many niggling details that I don't want to go into detail on that Diablo 3 did so well and so correctly. And Diablo 3 is a game that I enjoyed playing a lot in all of its difficulties, solo and with friends, and I'm going to enjoy playing again in the future, going back to either on my mains who are 60 going through Inferno, or my alts who are just going around having fun or doing whatever. And the final thing I wanted to say here is that I have been asked already if I think Diablo 3 qualifies in my art category. The answer is I have no idea, because Diablo 3 has only been out for a few months at this point. A game that is not that old cannot, by definition, be within the art category, because part of the requirement there is that it has to have staying power. It has to age well, and I don't know that yet. I am hopeful that it will, and I am hopeful that it will go somewhere. And one of the things I'm very hopeful about is they have acknowledged publicly that their old methods for in-game content don't work anymore, and they're going to have to try something else. I think that's a good sign. I think it's a sign that they're willing to see, oh, well, we made a misstep, let's go ahead and try and do it better. And emphasis on the let's try and do it better. So I have lots of hopes for Diablo 3 in the future, and I am really hoping that it will go somewhere. Who knows, I'm looking forward to the expansions, most assuredly. And again, I do say expansions, plural, because it is very likely they will have more than one. As I said, they have lots of content to cover, and that has kind of been the way they've been going lately. So we'll see if that's a good thing or not, and it will depend wholly on the content, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with having multiple expansions as long as they're good. It's always the emphasis point. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off, and hopefully not have too many hate messages in my message box tomorrow. I'll see y'all later.